Joining me now on the Knicks Film School Podcast, I am very excited to welcome our latest guest from The Athletic. I think we should probably, I already subscribe to The Athletic, but I feel like I should take out an additional subscription because we have so many Athletic NBA writers on this program because they're so damn good. He is actually a staff editor at The Athletic. Yep. He has been covering the NBA for more than 2 decades. He has worked for the NBA. You have seen him on FoxSports.com, NBA.com, ESPN.com, and on Twitter at Shot Dr. Jr. DRJR. Please welcome Rob Peterson. Hello, Rob.
Hey everyone. Thank you for having me, Jonathan. This is fun stuff.
Yeah. And I mean, I have to just because I'll say this before we get into what we're going to talk about today. You as a staff editor and head editor at The Athletic, your coverage is just top notch of the NBA.
Thank you. That's very kind of you to say.
And I have to say, unlike the regular season and the postseason, when I'm just constantly plugged in, I allowed myself to unplug a little bit for the last few months. So the email you get from The Athletic with the lead stories, if you're a subscriber, has been so helpful because on days when I don't have time to scroll Twitter, I'm like, okay, let me catch what I just missed. So shout out to whoever puts those emails together.
It's there's a new newsletter group, so they do a nice job. They do a nice job of that. Yeah,
there you go. So I have had you on, or have you on today, without even knowing that you spent many years in New York, which we found out before we started recording. Yep. So that's cool. But you just had a piece drop a few days ago about one of my favorite topics, which is the Basketball Hall of Fame, not the NBA Hall of Fame.
Correct.
Yes, right. How many? Let me ask you this. We'll start there before we get into the piece. How many people do you think still are not confused about that distinction, but don't even realize there is a distinction? Because I feel like the casual fan may not know.
Yeah, and I think I live 35 minutes south of Springfield, right up Interstate 91. My wife is a professor at Springfield College, where the game was invented. So it's. People don't know that it's not an NBA Hall of Fame. It is a Basketball Hall of Fame, which is good in the sense that there's diversity and inclusiveness with different levels of the sport. From the NBA, WNBA, international, the Writers Wing, the Kirk Gowdy Award. My sister was even in the Hall of Fame because she played high school ball, and they used to have these lockers. And I haven't been up there since the renovations, but they had these lockers, and you could look, and they had like little displays. And my sister played for a school in Milwaukee that won 91 straight games, and there was a photo of her team celebrating in the Hall of Fame. So, from my sister being in the Hall of Fame to the greats of all time being in the Hall of Fame, that is an inclusive, great space. The problem is if you want an NBA, if you just want to name the NBA greatest players, you're not going to get that. By my count, there have been 141 Hall of Famers who've played in the NBA, and give or take a few. But it's not exclusive to the NBA. So it's not an NBA Hall of Fame. It includes everybody. So when you talk about the Hall of Fame, and one of the things that we don't know about the Hall of Fame is who votes for this stuff. So they don't release results. They don't say this person got in with 79%. They don't say if this person got in was unanimous. Like the baseball writers, they've started to reveal who they'll vote for for Hall of Fame, but not basketball. We don't know.
And the international part of it, I think, is fascinating because I was just doing some research earlier today. And, it makes it because you could look up NBA players who were in the league at any given time who ended up making the Hall of Fame. And like Tony Kukoc is a name, right? Now, Tony Kukoc spent the majority of his career in the NBA, and he's in the Hall of Fame. Had it not been for, the international aspect of his career, Tony Kukoc probably not going to be in the Hall of Fame, but he's in there. But it makes it tough because where do you where does that line go? And there's obviously other international players and people who are in as as coaches, but then they also had a playing career. So it makes for some tough, if you're trying to parse this stuff out as you attempted to do, it makes it a little bit more difficult.
Yeah. And I tried to use this wasn't, I mean, I've been and you said this is one of your favorite topics, and I've been thinking about this for a long time, just because it's fun to think about. It's like, who are we watching now that is great?
Yes,
we can say who's great, but what are the metrics? And I didn't go too deep into, combining stats or anything like that. I just used some popular benchmarks that are familiar, and in part of it, in doing all these names, I noticed that if you led the league in scoring, you're in the Hall of Fame. Every person who has led the NBA in scoring is in the Hall.
Which I would not have guessed until I read your piece.
And I didn't notice that either. But you go to Basketball Reference and there's an asterisk next to every name. And it's like Bernard King, asterisk. Carmelo Anthony, asterisk. He's not eligible yet, but we'll talk about him later. But, Tracy McGrady, 3-time scoring champ. George Gervin. All these guys who led the league in scoring, in every eligible regular season MVP is in. And that is, so when you win 2, that's why I started off that piece with Giannis was, I thought it was going to be kind of, people are like, no, Giannis doesn't belong in the Hall of Fame. And then I didn't, in Twitter or in the comments, nobody mentioned that you're full of it with Giannis. And I was surprised because people like, he's only been in the league 8 years. He's 26. I'm like, yeah, but look at what he's done. 2 MVPs, finals MVP, defensive player of the year. That's a lot of hardware in a short amount of time. And a lot of that helps. I believe helps determine who goes into the Hall.
Because I'm a giant basketball nerd, and I too think about this stuff way too much. After reading the piece, I did my own list of like, okay, who, if they stop playing today, is in? Who, if they stop playing today, as you did, is probably it. Who has the argument? Much like you did, because I was curious where I came on this stuff mentally. I love that your jumping off point for the piece. And again, for anybody who hasn't read it, first of all, go read it. Second of all, you basically went through the league and said, okay, of everyone who's playing now, who's definitely in, who's almost certainly in, who has an argument. And you went through some retired players who are not yet eligible, but will soon become eligible as well. I love that your jumping off point was Basketball References Hall of Fame probability, because I cannot tell you how many hours of my life I have wasted looking at that and being like, well, why is this person a 0.998 and this person is right? And I'm just curious, what was that like the reason you thought to write the piece in the first place? Did you think of the piece and they're like, oh, why don't I use this? Like, where'd that come from?
I was, like I said, the Hall of Fame to me is a special place. And it was induction weekend up in Springfield. Plus in August, I think one or two accounts like posted the Hall of Fame index, and people went bananas. The probability index, they went bananas on Twitter as to like, this dude has a higher probability than this dude and that dude, and they couldn't believe it. So I thought, well, what if I look at that? Because Giannis is somewhere like in the, he's low like
68, 30s. I think.
Yeah. He's not 100%.
No, which I was surprised he was not higher.
Right, but the way they determine it is a lot of it is career based, long time career based stuff, and things like they actually factor in height. If you go to the page, they're like, we'll factor in the height of a player as to Hall of Fame probably. Yeah,
I didn't know that either.
But he should rate. He's pretty tall. But yeah, so somebody posted in August and people started arguing like Paul George has a better probability according to this scale than Paul George does. I mean, than Kawhi does. That's crazy. Things like that. So knowing what I knew about MVPs, because I had brought up the Derrick Rose exception before on Twitter.
We're also going to talk about,
it's never gotten any traction, but yeah, you have the MVPs, you have the scoring titles. Somebody mentioned that if you get 7 All-Star appearances, you're pretty much in the Hall of Fame. My thing was more all NBA than All-Star, because All-Star is a fan base thing, which is fine. That's great. But you definitely have to be one of the better players in the league to make an All-Star team. But all NBA is a different story. Those are pretty exclusive. So
not to get off on a tangent, but the All-Star thing is interesting to me. I think it comes up with Blake a little bit, although he has his All-NBAs. The guy who I would have been fascinated if his career did not go the way it did and he didn't end up piling up so many points is Vince Carter, because Vince Carter made a lot of those All-Star teams when he was, certainly not on All-NBA. I think he ended up making, off the top of my head, I think one All-NBA team. Maybe he made a second one.
I think there were like two. Yeah,
that sounds right. But I completely agree with you. I'm someone who looks at All-NBA as well. But I thought it was a great way to do it because, you look through that list, and to me at least, and here's the other thing about that. You have a bunch of guys who are like 98 or above. And then there are some people between like 98 and like 90, but it feels like tiers in that ranking. And that's kind of how I look at the history of basketball. Like, when a guy is in that top tier, know when he's just below that, right? Did you get that same sense as you were trying to write this?
Yeah, I was, that, and I think that was the thing with Jokic, and Lillard. So I had 11 locks, and I believe I had 6 near locks, and Lillard and Jokic were near locks, and I think Jokic was a near lock he has an MVP obviously, but his career is relatively short. Not just now if I would like, hey Rob, rewrite this, would you put Jokic in the lock section? Based on what my parameters were yeah. But, it's like if he has like 1 or 2 more, like if he finishes second or third or fourth in an MVP conversation, he'll make it. He'll also have his international play to factor in. So he's probably a lock. The only thing with me was like, it was just so recent that I had to take a step back and see, what was. And as for Dame, he has all the numbers. He has All-NBA. He has All-Star. He doesn't have the big hardware. He doesn't obviously a finals MVP because he hasn't been there. He doesn't have a league MVP. But he's like somewhere in the 91% probability because, well, he's just that good and he's piling up numbers. So, and he's one of the greatest shooters in NBA history. So all of that stuff comes into play. I think, like I said, we don't know, but I think that comes into play. So if you're talking about tiers, it's like you had that one tier where it's just like, 11. And then you would probably have that near tier and then the next near tier. So I would put Jokic and Lillard underneath that, like almost lock.
Sure. No, yeah.
So
absolutely.
But, a couple more years for those guys and they're not missing.
So so let's start getting into a couple of the players that have ties to the Knicks, and the most prominent of which I think is Carmelo Anthony. So your distinguishing feature for him was that he is, and I knew this in my head, but when I read it, I'm like, my goodness, he is actually 10th all time in the league in scoring, which is nuts. He is someone that, again, it's not really an interesting case now. But I wonder if he had, let's say, I don't know, 4 years ago, right? Or maybe maybe just when he got into the top 50, which is the criteria you use. If you're in the top 50, you got a pretty good chance of making it. I wonder if he had retired then and he's like, you know what? I don't feel like bouncing around the league past my prime. This whole Phil Jackson thing kind of got under my skin. I'd rather just go, enjoy my life. I wonder what the conversation would have been if there would have been a conversation about him, because he had all of his All-Star appearances still. He was, he had that aura about him. And yet, as we discussed on a recent podcast, there was also a whole segment of like the analytics community that like, look, he was never really one of the best players in the league. Like personally, where do you stand on Carmelo Anthony?
I think he's a lock, and I thought he was a lock back then when he was, the Phil Jackson stuff, and then he was bouncing around to Houston, just on the ability for him to put the ball in the basket. I mean, you have a ton of guys in the Hall of Fame who don't have Bernard King, Alex English, George Gervin. Those guys led the league in scoring, and they never went to a finals. None of those guys went to finals. They didn't win MVPs. What was Carmelo the best at doing? He was the best at putting the ball in the hole, which is, I think, the sole object of the game. You want to score, and he's one of the greatest scorers in NBA history. If this were 5 years prior, he'd still be in. Also, I think you have to factor in that he won a title with Syracuse.
Oh, yes.
And so that weighs heavily. And we could get into this with D Rose too. It's like they made the NCAA finals, but they didn't win. So if he had that win on it, we can get in that later. But you know what I'm saying? It's like that is just because of the inclusivity of the hall, or from what the patterns we've seen, that would get him in as well. So you have this stellar career where you've scored, even at 5 years ago, maybe he was at 22,000 points, right?
Yep.
And that's a lot of points. That is a lot of points. And there aren't many people in the history of basketball who have done that. So once you've done something that a lot of people in the history of basketball haven't done, you're probably headed to Springfield.
And I'll always feel bad because the year he finished third in MVP, usually that gets you on the All-NBA first team, but because of two guys by the name of LeBron James and Kevin Durant, unfortunately occupying those forward spots. Look at that spot. Just look at that spot that we have in the NBA right now. That's just crazy amount of talent at that level and at that position and for that long. I mean, LeBron's going into year 18, Melo's going into year 18. KD was a rookie. Let's put it this way: KD played for Seattle. Yes, right? He did.
His rookie year, he played for Seattle.
Yeah,
and the NBA should go back to Seattle, but hasn't been in Seattle for more than a decade and a half, or close to a decade and a half. So and yet
LeBron and KD, you could argue, were still top of their games, which makes that all the more impressive. Let's talk about a guy who had a bit of a different career, and that is Derrick Rose.
Mm-hmm.
Nothing would shock me in terms of Rose when it came time for him to, whenever he does retire, because as you said, every MVP is in there except for the ones that aren't yet eligible or still playing, right. and they're going to get
the ones
in.
Who are active. Yep.
Yeah, exactly. He won one.
Mm-hmm.
And not only, I'm curious, when you're, again, personally assessing Rose, it's LeBron, Rose, LeBron. He's the only one in that 5-year stretch who took that award away from him. I wonder, does that make the award maybe worth a little bit more? Or may some people, again, when it comes time to vote for him, look at it and say, voter fatigue. Nobody wanted to reward LeBron after he went to Miami. Do we take that award less seriously, or is it just an MVP is an MVP? I don't know.
Yeah. I think one of the interesting things about D Rose's MVP award was that he was the youngest to win it. Obviously, he had 1 year of college, and then he was in the league. Won Rookie of the Year. When I was, as I mentioned to you prior to this, I was writing for NBA.com at the time. In 2008, 2009. And I covered that insane Bulls Celtics first round series where they had multiple overtime games. And he broke Kareem's rookie scoring record in his debut. I can't remember exactly how many points he had, but it was something like 37 or 38 in his debut. And he broke Kareem's record for scoring. And you're thinking, this guy, with his physical talent, with his ability to take over games, ball in his hand against a team like the Celtics, who were designed to that was the Thibodeau defense where they were designed to drive guys to the side, and he was just killing people. And then 2 years later, he wins MVP. So he was very young. That's a feather in his cap. I can see the argument where people was it was a narrative thing. People were tired of LeBron. They didn't want, that whole decision thing was a joke. There's no way he's MVP of the league. If we give him MVP of the league, it's just, how about this guy? Well, D Rose deserved it in the sense that his performance was good enough. But I could see, writers going, that's we're not going to give it to him. I don't know that for sure, but I can see both sides of that narrative story that has developed over time. That being said, you win a rookie. And one of the things I didn't take into account for my article was Rookie of the Year. And one of the reasons I did not take that into account is because you have a lot of Rookie of the Year that just really didn't have a great career.
Tyreek Evans won Rookie of the Year, and what was in retrospect a pretty loaded class, and that's the first thing that comes to mind.
Yeah, and so that's not always a measure of success or future success. It's a measure of what happened that year. But the MVP it's like, and the thing is like after he won that MVP, he was on he was on a Hall of Fame track. His physical skills for a guy his size, it was just the Derrick Rose you see now is not the one you saw then. And it was just like, I'll never forget the dunk he did on Dragic. I mean, it's just like, it's like he hit a level and that wasn't nice. Another level. And with both hands and it just behind his head and he yammed it. It's like, this guy is going to be a superstar for a long time. And just injuries have taken a toll. It was the whole season. And, the one person I think of when I think of D Rose is Grant Hill.
Can I tell you, I literally just pulled up Hill's page because I was going to bring up if Rose has Hill's last, and he's on his way to having it, right? If he has his last, whatever you want to give me, 7-8 years, might that make, but the difference is, so Hill never won MVP, but 5 All-NBAs, 7 All-Stars. But even then, the All-Stars voted him by the fans in years that he didn't really even play in Orlando because he was so popular. So like, again, it's so hard to compare these guys.
Right. And right now, that's the only reason I put him as the Derrick Rose exception is because, he missed a lot of time for injury and he hasn't been able to pile up the numbers that some other guys have been able to pile up. It's like, I think he has 11,900 points, which is good for what he's been able to do.
Sure.
But when you put in historical context, it's not a lot. So if he'll be 33 in October 4th, I think. And so if he can play a couple more years at a high level, and don't get me wrong, playing in New York helps. If you do well there and you do well for the Knicks and the Knicks, continue to make playoffs, advance a little further in the playoffs than they did this year, and he's an important part of that, that could sway some people. And I didn't write this article saying like, I don't like Derrick Rose or, he's a crappy player or anything like that. I was just looking at what we think might be the springboard to Springfield.
Yes.
And usually it's an MVP. And in his case, how spring is that springboard?
Again, if there are 10 voters who remember this when the time comes, I'd probably be a little surprised, but like he was the best player in a playoff series on a playoff team last year. He was the best Knick that was in that series. And like, will somebody like in the recesses of their mind when they're picking nits, whatever it is, 10 years from now on Derrick Rose, I wonder if they'll think of that. The only other 2 names I thought of with him, and again, these guys didn't have injury concerns, but started so big and then tailed off, were Wes Unseld, obviously won MVP and Rookie of the Year in the same season. And then Walt Bellamy is another guy who, again, Rookie of the Year, came out guns blazing, 31 points, 19 rebounds, and then kind of subsided after that. Again, no injuries, but both of those guys are in.
You'd be surprised at looking at Unseld. If you just put like Unseld stats up, you'd be like, this guy's a Hall of Famer. It's crazy. I think he's averaged something like 10.9 points per game. Something.
Yeah, and he had several seasons where he didn't, and like his prime of his career didn't average 10 points a game. It's wild looking at him.
So one thing with Rose, I think that you can put into historical context with that, like a Wes Unseld or somebody who's won 1 MVP, 1 Rookie of the Year. The thing about Unseld is that he also won a title.
Yes.
Glory be if the Knicks win a title.
Your lips to God's ears.
Yeah.
That would be nice. A couple more, and then I'm going to get you out of here. Amare Stoudemire is a guy you mentioned in passing. I believe it was, let me see if I remember this. I should, in the PER, right? He's in the top 50 PER, which again is a pretty good indicator.
Yeah.
He's another one for me that is just, and his percentage on the basketball reference page is pretty respectable.
Yeah.
It's 72%, 72.9%, which is not a guarantee. I think I had this down. There's someone that played a very long time ago that's like at 84%, didn't make it. Tim Hardaway, not junior, Tim Hardaway senior, not in. He's at like 79. So it's not a guarantee. But he has quite the resume. And I just wonder how much, because a lot of those it was all NBA first teams at center when that position at that time was, it was not, it didn't quite carry the same weight as the rest. Gut feeling, do you think Amare gets in?
Ooh, that's a good one. When he came into the league, he'd been to like a lot of high schools and nobody knew, and he was kind of a risky pick. And then he exploded in Phoenix, and then he paired with Steve Nash. And that one year, the first year Nash won his MVP, those guys were unstoppable. That pick and roll, the 7 seconds or less. And then I think the reason Nash won his second MVP was Amare was injured the next year, and the Suns were the same. So Nash was the engine for, the Suns finished with almost a similar record. I can't remember off the top of my head, but it's very, very close. And people will dispute that MVP more than the first one. But Amare had all the talent in the world, center, power forward, great hands, powerful, couldn't stop him once he got on the block, could shoot. I actually did a one-on-one with him for Hoop Magazine back in 2011 when he came to New York.
Wow. I think I own that copy of Hoop Magazine. I
went up to the training facility and up the Sawmill, and we talked, and he mixed grape juice and orange juice. And I thought that was pretty interesting. So that's another thing. It's like, based on what I wrote, what does he have to say that would say, yes, he's a Hall of Famer? Is it an MVP? Nope. Is it a finals MVP? Nope. Is it a championship? Nope. But the body of work is very, very solid. Yep. Though what we're talking, somebody mentioned in the comments, it's like, it's not the solid Hall of Fame, it's the Hall of Fame. It's not. So he's probably one of those guys, Kevin Love. It's another guy with a high percentage, and that people were like on Twitter were going bananas about. I love Kevin Love. One of the first stretch big dudes, he would crush on the boards and then take you out behind the 3-point line and bust in your face. And he did that for some pretty bad Minnesota teams. But he won a title he was an important part of a title with Cleveland, and he put up a lot of numbers. And so a lot of this is, it's strange to say the numbers back it up, but sometimes it's also subjective in there. And at least the way we see how people get into the hall. So from the outside, I don't know how it works on the inside. I have I can't say that I know how they put this together.
And that's part of the toughness of having these discussions, because you're having discussions about a process that you don't really know much about other than the results, and you try to parse out. Like my inclination always with this stuff is, like, I was thinking about Kevin Love earlier today, is you have the feeling with the Hoops Hall that, like, if it's a borderline guy, or at least to me, it feels like the borderline guy usually gets in, or at least it seems like that's the way it's been going. Like, I hate to, people are going to think I hate this player because I always bring him up as the example, and I don't. I remember him being a really good player, like Mitch Richmond. Yeah. Mitch Richmond's in the Hall of Fame. Okay. Mitch Richmond was a very, very, very nice player. Scored a lot of points, in Sacramento for a lot of years, and was part of a pretty significant Golden State team. But I don't know. I don't know what to do with that, I guess. And I understand, and that's one of the reasons I didn't do retired players that were in the eligibility window, like Sean Marion, whose tough one.
Advanced stats are awesome.
Yeah.
And was a great player on those Suns teams. And then, there are a couple other guys who are just on the cusp, and you're like, well, I could see that. But the way I wrote the article, they didn't have that one defining like moment or campaign, or where people considered them the best in the league. I think we have to remember that, we have about 450 active players. There are 450 active players in the NBA. And if you're the best of 450, that's better than being the best in baseball, where, there are rosters, there are 32 teams of 26, or in the NFL where there are 32 teams of 53. It's easier to impact, with the exception of a quarterback. It's probably easier to impact or affect a game as a professional basketball player than any other sport, because you have to play offense and defense. There are only 10 guys on the court at the time. So your impact at that moment is huge. I could be a middle linebacker and be a great middle linebacker, but if I'm not making 15 tackles a game or 2 tackles a loss for, that kind of stuff.
Sure.
Or
yeah.
with the Baseball Hall of Fame, I mentioned in the article, it's like 300 wins, batting 300 wins, 500 home runs. There were benchmarks. And I tried to see if there were any benchmarks.
And you did you did a great job. And then, yet there could be one name in there like Mark Jackson. Mark Jackson never got any serious, unless I'm mistaken. I don't think he ever got serious consideration for Hall of Fame.
I don't think so either.
Yeah. And he's right
in the
there.
top 10 of assists, and he's not in the Hall. It was interesting to see the differences. Points mattered more than anything, it seemed, than, putting the ball in the hole. Getting the ball to somebody to score was less important than the actual guy who scored, or rebounding the ball. There are a bunch of dudes in the top like 25, 30 of rebound, like Buck Williams.
Yeah.
Not in the Hall. He probably should be.
And you mentioned him another time in an advanced stat, I believe.
Yeah. He rated highly in some of the advanced stats, but he's not in the Hall. He probably should be. And he's probably one of those dudes that will get in like Bob Dandridge this year, where it was a veterans committee.
Yeah.
Where you have a lot of influential teammates who can vouch for you in committee meetings and point to this and that and those and just say he was important here. Look at his numbers there. Guys loved him. That kind of stuff. With Bob Dandridge, he won 2 titles. And he ranked very highly for players throughout the 70s in terms of, accumulation of points and rebounds and stuff like that. So that could come into play for some of these guys. We're going to have a loaded class in 2023 with Tony Parker and Dwayne Wade and Dirk Nowitzki. Parker doesn't have the quote unquote numbers, but he's a finals MVP. He's a 4-time champion, and the international comes into play. So
some All-NBAs in there, and you forget about that stuff.
Yeah. And it's interesting. It doesn't necessarily hit you in the face, but once you dig down and you look at it, it's like, yeah, he probably belongs there. So
the last name, then I'll let you go. And he had a cup of coffee here with New York, and then went on his merry way. He's about to start his coaching career in Portland. I'm shocked that Billups isn't in yet. Because you mentioned you got to have that standout thing. He was Finals MVP, and like if you ask me personally, when you think of the early aughts or the mid aughts Pistons, like who's the first player that comes to mind? For me, it's Chauncey Billups.
Right.
And that was a great team for a long time. So
it was, and it was interesting because, they had that gentleman's sweep against the Lakers in 2004.
Yes, they did. Yeah.
And I covered that series for NBA.com, and you could just feel the life being squeezed out of the Lakers. And Chauncey was a big reason for that. I think game 3, they didn't guard Kobe on a 3, and he tied the game, sent it to overtime, and Lakers won. But when they went back to Detroit, it was just, that team was a great team. You had Rip Hamilton and Tayshaun Prince and Ben Wallace, and now Ben Wallace is in the Hall of Fame. So you have to think that, but that's, Defensive Player of the Year plays a big part in that too,
Sure.
Because when, not every DPOY is in the Hall, but when you win it 4 times,
and we have a guy who's one win away from getting to that 4 in Rudy Gobert, and that's good. But again, he doesn't have the. Maybe he gets to the title at some point, but
right. But that's the thing. It's like, how can you deny Rudy Gobert a spot in the Hall if he has 4 Defensive Players of the Year and Ben Wallace is in the Hall? I mean, who would you rather have? They're very similar players in the sense that they control the boards on defense. They play defense. But Rudy's 6'7" 2", and Ben was 6'8", 6'9".
I look at that Pistons more. I mean, look, Ben Wallace, obviously he earned those awards, but that was a great defensive team.
Yes.
Everything Utah does on defense is because, and I understand he's had some issues in the playoffs here and there, but who knows, maybe that'll factor in prominently for some folks. But it's like they're a great defense because of him and what he's able to do. So I would imagine that will factor in prominently, but again, who knows? Because we don't know.
Yeah, exactly.
Criteria.
So kids, if you Google any of the like mid 2004 teams or 2005 teams on YouTube, watch out. The scores aren't what you're accustomed to.
The spacing is not what you're accustomed to.
71 67s, 84 83. And you're like, this was the NBA. It's like, this was the NBA. So
it's a halftime score now.
Beware kids. Yes.
Yeah. Ben. Yeah, this is all great. I could sit here and talk to you about this for hours, but you have things to do, as do our listeners, I'm sure. This was a lot of fun because, again, this is one of those pieces where I'm stopping every couple of seconds as I'm reading it to go look up this stat or that stat. Right. And that's the type of stuff that I love. Last but not least, can you just let the folks know at home where they could find not only you and your stuff, but perhaps some other content that you'd like to promote?
Yeah, I'm with The Athletic and grateful to be with The Athletic. It's been a great place. As you mentioned, Vork has gave you my email to get on this. So that's awesome. He's a wonderful writer. We have so many wonderful writers at The Athletic. And for about another week, we have a 50% off. So if you want to subscribe, it's 50% off for new subscribers. And you can find this piece on our NBA page. So if you go to theathletic.com/NBA, the Hall of Fame piece is up there. You can argue. I don't mind. I don't hate your team. I don't hate your players. I don't.
Why are you lying? You hate everybody. Stop lying.
Everybody but the Bucks. I don't hate. But it's just like, it's interesting to look at this stuff. So as long as I'm not stupid about it, as long as we can make a cogent argument and shake hands afterwards, I'm good. So that's what I tried to do with this piece, is just kind of look at what was going on at the time and who we're watching right now. That is just, to have 11 locks for the Hall of Fame right now, I think is just amazing. And 5 of those being on the Lakers. I mean, think about it. It's like Melo, Bron, Dwight Howard, Anthony Davis, and somebody, people could argue that, and Russ. And Russ is dude's averaged triple-double for 4 different seasons. It's just
they're all locks. Yeah. And for anybody who doesn't think Dwight Howard is a lock, again, read the piece, but there is no argument. He was. I kind of mentioned early on, like in early on, it's like, hey, do people think Dwight Howard's not a Hall of Famer? Maybe he's not a Hall of Famer because of this. And I just like, some dude from Orlando or some Dwight Howard fan just came right at me. I was like, no. I wasn't saying that he's not. I was just saying, what if people? And he's like, no. Yeah. They went down the list. So he was something else in his prime. It was just he was a force to be reckoned with, and Shaq was jealous. Shaq was a little jealous.
It was a little jealous.
This was a lot of fun. Rob,
I had a great time. Thank you so much.
Absolutely. This won't be the last time we do it.